I've made the comment that compliance is security, but it's not the elimination of risk. And the reason I say that is in the absence of compliance, someone who's worked in security knows that if there was no compliance framework or compliance requirements, going to your developers and engineers and saying, hey, we need you to do all these things, it's less likely that it would ever get done unless you had a compliance framework or requirement to point to. So compliance helps force security be a priority for the organization, get investment, be taken seriously, and actually be done. But again, it's not the elimination of risk. There's never going to be an entire elimination of risk unless you, like you said, you kind of stifle all innovation, all, kind of advancement and growth and new ideas and new ways of doing things and things like that for organizations too. So I've kind of quipped that, compliance is the floor, not the ceiling.
Welcome to the season 3 of The Elephant in AppSec, the podcast to explore, challenge, and boldly face the AppSec elephants in the room. I'm Alexandra, your host and AppSec enthusiast and growth manager at Escape.
Today, I'm joined by Chris Hughes, the CEO and co-founder of Aquia, a cybersecurity consulting firm supporting secure digital transformation for U.S. federal, state, and defense agencies. He previously also served as a cyber innovation fellow at CISA. Chris is also the co-author of Software Transparency and Effective Vulnerability Management books and hosts the Resilient Cyber podcast and Substack. He is also a frequent speaker and commentator on AppSec, software supply chain security, and DevSecOps. In this episode, we unpack why compliance doesn't equal security, but in its absence, the state of cybersecurity would be worse. We explore how federal cybersecurity policy shapes startup innovation and whether the future of security will be defined more by lawyers than by security practitioners. We also reflect on how the skill set in security has evolved, from deep technical expertise to a growing emphasis on soft skills and communication. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and follow it on your favorite podcasting app or YouTube. It's the best way to avoid missing future episodes. And with that, get ready to hear Chris's opinions. Dive right in.
Hi, Chris. I'm super excited to have you on the Elephant and AppSec podcast with me. I know you are really active, on LinkedIn and with your newsletter, Resilient Cyber. So I'm super excited to talk with you about the topics that you've been quite vocal on recently. And I saw you got a lot of feedback there as well. So I saw some posts where people were saying that they were actually, struck by your post in the morning, in the afternoon and evening, especially about the ones that where you mentioned that compliance doesn't equal security, but without it, kind of the state of cybersecurity would not be the same, or it would not be better than it is now, which is kind of I agree with, but there is always a line, between innovation and compliance, at least here where I'm based in Europe, and there is a lot of talk about how regulations actually hinder innovation, especially in tech, and that's why, for example, we still don't have the same power of AI that exists in the US, and a lot of startups, are limited because of the compliance, because of privacy regulations. So it's very hard to draw that line. And actually, I had a question, for you. Where do you think we should draw that line where compliance stay important, but, it's still doesn't foster innovation at the same level?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I'll be honest with you, I don't have a perfect answer because it is such a broad domain of different organizations, industries, organization type sizes. There's so much at play, whether it's startups, founders, investors, consumers, et cetera. And security, is an interesting aspect of that, right? And I've been talking a lot about both the compliance piece and then also the distinction between the EU and the US, where, as you point out, the EU is on this path of, I think they've even said it themselves, of trying to be a regulatory superpower. And that's awesome if that's your goal, but it's going to have major ramifications in terms of your economy, your national security, kind of the wealth of the ecosystem in terms of people willing to start a company, investors willing to found or invest in the ecosystem, things like that. And we see that, right? As you point out, in terms of AI in particular, like some startups won't even release certain products in that ecosystem because they're worried about, EU AI Act and DORA and NIS2 and on and on and on, where the U.S., there's a much more rigid compliance, must do X, Y, and Z approach in the EU, where in the U.S., it's a much more voluntary best practices, recommendations, guidelines, but they're not hard requirements in many cases. And that's good and bad. It allows people to innovate and kind of adopt what they think they should do from a best practice perspective and things like that. But again, it doesn't necessarily force them to do many things. So this is why, going back to your question about compliance and security, I've made the comment that, compliance is security, but it's not the elimination of risk. And the reason I say that is in the absence of compliance, anyone who's worked in security knows that if there was no compliance framework or compliance requirements, going to your developers and engineers and saying, hey, we need you to do all these things, it's less likely that it would ever get done unless you had a compliance framework or requirement to point to. So compliance helps force security be a priority for the organization, get investment, be taken seriously, and actually be done. But again, it's not the elimination of risk. There's never going to be an entire elimination of risk unless you, like you said, you kind of stifle all innovation, all, kind of advancement and growth and new ideas and new ways of doing things and things like that for organizations too. So I've kind of quipped that, compliance is the floor, not the ceiling. When we think about security, it's the baseline level of things we should do, but it's not all that we should do. And then again, the problem there is getting the organization to invest in doing more than what is required is hard. And then also there's nuance there too, because any of us who have been a practitioner for some time, you can look at compliance frameworks and point to certain controls or requirements and say, this doesn't even make sense. Who the hell wrote this? Was this an actual security practitioner that wrote this? Do they even understand how the technology works? Because a lot of times these compliance frameworks don't align well with reality and how things really work in the real world. So there's a lot of nuance to the question and to the topic. And I think that's why it's so hotly debated, is because people want to take one stance or another, compliance or, just kind of a lack of compliance and security. And it's just it doesn't work like that. It's much more gray.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a gap, between the compliance, as you mentioned, and the real world. And I think there was a lot of talk about that. I think also I read about Ross Haluk mentioning the lawyers, the future of security. I think you also talked about that. We're going to be defined by lawyers, but not the security practitioners. That's where it comes to. And it's, I think, a big problem. So how do you think we can actually bridge that gap from how can, for example, product security engineers, they have implement some practical steps to actually ensure their expertise, their, day-to-day activities, their day-to-day challenges can be actually represented in those frameworks.
Yeah, I think that's where, having actual practitioners and input from, people that operate in the real world in these organizations, both in engineering, development, cybersecurity, collaborating on policy and process and frameworks and things like that, because otherwise it'll be written in a way that it's not applicable. It doesn't kind of align well with the way things work in reality. And often, again, going back to security, I wrote another piece called the cybersecurity delusion problem. We often think that, cyber is the center of the universe and all that should matter to the business, right? It's the only risk that matters. When in reality, the businesses they're worried about financial risk, speed to market, growing revenue, return on investment for investors, appeasing consumers and growing more customers. And they have a lot of things that they're concerned about. And cybersecurity is one of their risks, but it's not the only risk. And often, it's not even the most consequential risk. If they have an incident of some sort, it's very unlikely that they often go out of business or, there was even studies in 2024 showing that there's I think it was less than 2% or less than 4% stock dip for less than 60 days. And then the stock price goes back to where it was. So the consequence isn't actually as damning or, significant as we may hope or wish it was. So it's a risk to the business, of course, but it's not the only risk. And there's many risks in consideration that the business is focused on. So I think, having practitioners involved in the policy-making process would be key. And then also security kind of stepping out of our bubble and engaging with developers and engineering teams and getting in hand in terms of what they're working on, how they're building it, why they're building it, understanding what their incentives are and what's driving them is another key thing that we need to do too.
Has your perception on the business changed since you actually became a CEO of Aquia, or not at all?
I wouldn't say necessarily since I've been the CEO of Aquia, but I think it's as I've matured. That when I first started in security, all you're reading about is the CIA triad and reputational harm and business risk and all these things, and all you see and hear is cybersecurity. It's the only thing that you think about. And then as you go on in your career, you realize hey, these peers that I work with, they have incentives that are different than mine. They have motivations that are different than mine. The business actually has a lot of broader objectives and focus areas that are beyond cybersecurity, and it's just kind of for me, it's just been a maturation of my role in security and realizing hey, the picture is much bigger than security for the business. We're a piece of it. We're a critical piece of it, especially in this digital world, but we're not the only thing. And it's just been, kind of an evolving perception of mine as I've kind of grown in my career and maybe getting a little bit older, been doing this a little bit longer, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the sentiment that we come in when we are still young and idealistic about the world, but probably in any role, actually, I think that we're the most important, not only in the security. And at the beginning, you also mentioned, in your answer that in the US, a lot of compliance is on voluntarily basis. Why do you think that's the case? Is it really that the economy drives the most of things forward in the US, while in in Europe, it's some other things? Is it because of kind of capital gain in a sense that it's voluntarily, or maybe you have more insight?
I think there's several factors to that. One is I've wrote about this too, but like when we think about like if I was to ask you what does it mean, like if we want to say businesses must be secure, right? What does that even? What does secure even mean? We don't have a universally agreed upon definition of what is secure or what is security. When we think about things like software liability, like there's no real good way to apply that because what are the exact practices that all organizations must do? And we all agree that these are the things. We don't have a universally agreed upon thing like that. And then also, again, going back to the markets that I talked about is like Kelly Shortridge has a great piece called Markets Don't Give a about cybersecurity. And that's because, typically an incident doesn't devastate a business. Consumers keep using the product, companies keep buying it, the market keeps, purchasing shares, et cetera. Share prices don't go down significantly, like I talked about. We even see security vendors having massive incidents and data breaches and things like this, or constant vulnerabilities, and people continue to use the product. And it's because the market factors are driving things much more than you like you talked about. It's hard to rip and replace a product, or maybe it works well enough for your budget, or there's a lot of factors at play. Cybersecurity is not the only thing. I think that's what's driving it. Where in the EU, it's much more of a rigid compliance. You must do X, Y, and Z with not maybe as much consideration for the broader economic and market factors that are at play. And I think that's kind of bearing fruit in the economy of the EU, for better or worse, right? And and that's, you kind of got to live with what you vote for and what you implement.
Yeah, I mean, usually the consensus that it is for worse, at least in the tech world, where, for example, I work in, and you mentioned like everyone has its own definition of security. So what's yours?
It's honestly, it's fluid. Like, I always go back to like, it's a risk, it's like thinking about the risk tolerance of the business, right?
Yep.
You need to define what is our risk tolerance? What are we willing to accept? And that's something you got to talk to your executive peers about, whether it's, the business CEO, et cetera, the board and so on. Like what level of risk are they willing to accept? And then you can kind of tailor your controls and implementation, mitigating controls, et cetera, accordingly. Because it's going to look different for every organization. Someone may be able to tolerate quite a bit of risk because they have the financial capital and the market share, whatever, right, to kind of weather an incident, for example, where other organizations absolutely cannot, have a breach of some sort, or it really depends. That's why, I think it's risk tolerance, and a lot of organizations never really define that. And so we kind of do what the framework says, but we never actually step back and say, hey, for our organization, what's the level of risk we're willing to accept? How do we define that? And how do we go out and implement security accordingly?
And do you think like risk policies at the federal level impact then in the long run, or maybe even the shorter run, the startups, or maybe smaller companies?
Yes and no. I think that it depends. Like if you're selling to the federal government, for example, they apply these things universally. They have like FedRAMP if you're a cloud service provider. CISA last year released their secure software development and attestation requirement for all companies selling to the federal government. So that's going to impact everyone and anyone doing business with the federal government. Where commercial, it's a bit different, But also, those, as I've matured again in my career, like those regulations that we think are just security on the surface, sometimes they're actually there to be a regulatory moat for some of the incumbents and the larger companies, because they can afford to navigate FedRAMP, or they can afford to implement a secure software development lifecycle, where a smaller company, they're just trying to get product market fit. Maybe they don't even have a security team. Maybe they have one person who's juggling, the CISO hat and the security engineer and architect hat, and et cetera, et cetera. So it really depends on the organization in terms of like the burden for them and the industry that they're in terms of what they'll have to navigate.
Yeah, I think so. For sure, you've been a quite big advocate, for federal innovation, federal security innovations, or innovations applied to federal cybersecurity. Like I came across one of your repos on GitHub that I don't know, like I think you've created like a couple of years ago, something like that, where you included recommendations focusing on DevSecOps and the cloud. And what was the initial goal of that, actually?
So In my career, like I started off, by way of background, I started off in the U.S. military, the U.S. Air Force, and then I was a federal civilian, which means like a federal employee with a couple different agencies. So I've been with the Navy and the FedRAMP team. And this is going to sound bad maybe to some of your audience, but in a way, federal is kind of like a microcosm of the EU, but in the U.S. We're a laggard. We're more rigid from a compliance perspective. We tend to be late to adopt new technologies. It's just, it's very bureaucratic. It's almost like it's bifurcated from the broader U.S. economy in terms of how we do things from technology perspective. And I've spent a lot of my time in my career there using old technology, going through these rigid paper-based compliance requirements, like being late to, adopt broader, newer technologies or new ways of doing things like DevSecOps and agile software development and so on. So I've been trying to advocate that, hey, we need to get the federal ecosystem on par with the U.S. commercial ecosystem when it comes to technology and the way we do things like DevSecOps, for example, of integrating security with development and with operations and, all those kind of things. So that's what kind of drove me to kind of be an advocate for that, is trying to say, hey, like the public sector, U.S. federal agencies, Department of Defense, like we don't have to be like this. We can adopt commercial practices from a technology and security perspective too.
Do you think it would make sense to make, for example, for draft certifications in any sense easier? So federal actually, for example, startups, who want to collaborate with the government or want to have an idea, that actually simplifies government life, that they can actually do it?
Yeah, this is a tricky one because, like, on one hand, the commercial space doesn't have as much rigorous security requirements, but they're not dealing with, citizen personal information or medical information or Department of Defense national security systems, et cetera. So we need something, right? Maybe like a FedRAMP. But the problem is FedRAMP has been around for over a decade now. In a market of tens of thousands of SaaS services, it has about 360 that are approved. It shows you it's drastically constraining the federal government's access to commercial innovation and technologies from a cloud perspective. So it's a dichotomy of like we have a more rigid, process of getting a level of risk assurance around what the government uses, but as a trade-off, now we've massively constrained what the government can get access to in terms of technologies. So you got to pick your poison. In terms of which route you want to go. But there is something in the defense industry in the United States called CMMC, if you've heard that, right?
Okay. What is that?
So that's the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. It's like all the defense industrial-based companies doing the business with the DoD in the United States, they have to go through a third-party authorizing assessment organization, to get assessed, right, for their security practices or security program, similar to FedRAMP. And that imposes a massive cost on the business, right, these small businesses in particular. But the problem is the reason this came about is before it used to be self-attested. You can just say, hey, yes, we're doing this. We have these things in place. But incidents kept happening showing, hey, maybe they're not being honest. Maybe they don't have a security program in place. Maybe they're not doing the things they said they were doing. So it's kind of a dichotomy between self-attestation, just taking the business's word, right, the vendor's word, versus having a third party that goes and assesses and assures you of what they're doing. And each of those has a trade-off that you're making, basically.
Yeah, I think third-party risk assessment is very tricky because you have to sometimes rely on the word of other vendors and the transparency. You have to kind of pick vendors that you can think will be transparent with you in the long run if something happens. But it's almost impossible to 100% trust them. And then you have like the whole supply chain is actually one of your expert topics as well, that you have to think how everything is kind of linked, together, and where can be potential risks within that. Yes, since you published your book on the supply chain security in 2023. Right? So it was kind of before the hype of last year, because I think last year, it was a huge hype on this topic. It was, in a sense, you were ahead of your time. I don't know if you can say that. What actually, pushed you to write this book, and what do you think changed since then?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely plenty of folks and experts and practitioners out there that were kind of beating the supply chain drum for years and even decades, and there's research papers going back, 10, 20 years about, supply chains and implicit trust and things like that. So I definitely, I wasn't the only person thinking about these things, but, I did see like incidents like SolarWinds and Log4j and, the impact on the broader ecosystem and realizing like, hey, we are just really ill prepared as a society, as an ecosystem when it comes to software supply chain security. So I started like looking for everything I can find to read about this, and I realized there's no book on this. Like you would think, right, how interconnected all the businesses are, how interconnected all of our technology is, all of our digital systems, but there was really no book on that. So I set out to write a book on software transparency with a co-author named Tony Turner through Wiley, and it was really well received, by the industry, and it was eye-opening too as I read. I was reading everything I could find and then writing and kind of condensing that into the book. And you realize how complicated things are, from open source software, dependencies, transitive dependencies, SaaS providers, managed service providers, cloud service. It goes on and on, right? The ecosystem is incredibly complex and interconnected. And that's, I think we're all increasingly realizing that. And last year, things just kept happening. XE utilities, many breaches of big vendors like the Microsofts, all the CrowdStrike, et cetera, all the way to the smaller providers and vendors. And it's just a very fragile, ecosystem that we have in terms of how everything is connected, from vendors and products and software.
Like, I think for sure last year it was crazy with all the breaches, and I had also a lot of talks on the podcast about it. So I think for you I had a very specific question about it. What do you think is special in security when it comes to federal supply chain? Because I know personally not so much about that.
So there's a lot of similarities in terms of how we consume software and how we connect with other organizations and maybe externally share data and things like that. What makes it unique is often the organizational mission that's involved. Whether you're Department of Defense, you're dealing with weapon systems, national security data, control unclassified information, or your federal agencies, maybe you're dealing with national health data or things like that nature, Veterans Affairs, et cetera. So that makes it a little tricky in terms of the type of data that's involved, and sensitivity and the impact perhaps from a societal perspective. And then again, going back to the fact that the federal government, they can implement some of these rigorous requirements from a compliance perspective for their vendors, for their supply chain, that maybe the commercial ecosystem doesn't have as much, they don't have as much muscle to flex in that regard. Like the federal government spends tens of billions of dollars a year on software and technology. So they have a lot of purchasing power to kind of move things in a certain direction, and that's what they've been trying to do.
And in this case, since they have so much purchasing power, what do you think is the percentage that actually should be dedicated to security?
That's a good question too, and I don't know that I have a perfect answer. Like you see a lot of trends, like a 10% of IT spend or X percent. Again, I think it really depends on the organization in terms of your risk tolerance, what internal capabilities you have, how broad your what type of data you're kind of responsible for safeguarding and things like that. So I don't have a perfect answer for that. I think it really depends, what level you need to spend essentially to get to your level of risk tolerance and mitigating, the risk that you're uncomfortable with, basically, if that makes sense.
It does. I think it's just very hard, for example, I guess, for the government to estimate the cost of security breach, since we always have this talk, IBM estimates this amount of 4 million on the cost of security breach. But can you actually estimate it for government? I don't think so.
Yeah. And government's also unique in the sense that if I'm a commercial business, right, and I have an incident that has a financial consequence of some sort, I only have so much capital. Either I can afford to pay and stay in business and weather the storm, or I can't. If I'm the federal government, they have nearly an infinite amount of capital via the taxpayer that they can leverage to continue on. Where a business, you can go out of business. It's much harder for the government to go kind of quote unquote out of business from an incident or a data breach or a financial impact like that, because their level of capital and the ability to tap into the taxpayer and debt and print money and all those kind of things are things that the commercial sector simply can't do. It's a totally different paradigm.
But do you think in this case they approach the security of, let's say, vulnerability management differently, since it's also one of the topics of your expertise? Because sometimes commercial companies, they can even afford not fix their criticals, but can the government afford not fix their criticals?
So what's interesting here is the government, again, the public sector, I called, kind of the federal government in the U.S. kind of a microcosm of the EU, for example, an example of the EU.
Yeah.
I know I say that because as the industry around AppSec, and you've had some great people on around AppSec, and we're talking about things like known exploitation probability with EPSS or reachability analysis of what's running, to prioritize vulnerabilities. The federal government runs on policy that has been written years or even decades ago in terms of how they prioritize vulnerabilities. So their heavy-handed, compliance-driven, paper-based approach, it hasn't kept pace with the state of AppSec and the state of vulnerability exploitation and prioritization. So they're actually a laggard again. in that context. Many agencies are still doing just CVSS prioritization with no consideration of asset criticality, data sensitivity, exploitability, reachability. They're not doing anything like that. It's like, hey, the FedRAMP policy says, or hey, the federal executive, vulnerability requirements from NIST say we must do CVSS, so that's what we do. And that ecosystem is a laggard, and they're actually, facing outsized risk because of not adopting modern practices. And they're burying teams in thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities that may not mean anything because they're not reachable or not exploited or not exploitable. So that's something that, that ecosystem just hasn't caught up to. The federal ecosystem hasn't caught up to commercial best practice, again, in that context around vulnerability prioritization.
What modern practices do you think would be a priority to implement?
So they have CISA KEV, the known exploited vulnerability catalog from CISA. That is a requirement for federal agencies. But they've from my experience of working with many different federal agencies, both on the civilian side and the national security defense side, they've been slow to adopt like exploit prediction scoring system or reachability analysis from kind of application perspective, or runtime reachability, for example, or even really effectively implement things like business asset criticality of the asset involved in that equation, or the data sensitivity of the data that the asset has access to, and et cetera, like things like that. But they still largely are just using the blunt instrument of CVSS and then KEV. KEV is a good first step, a good step in the right direction, but it's far from exhaustive. But I'll say, I'm not picking on the federal ecosystem because any organization is struggling with this. There's reports that the average, like last year, we saw CVEs grow double digits again year over year. I think it was like 40,000 new CVEs in 2024. It's like 37% growth or something. Like, ask any organization, commercial or federal, has your vulnerability management program gotten 37% more effective since last year? Probably not. Have you gotten 37% more resources or 37% more spend on tooling, et cetera? No, in many cases. So we're struggling to keep up, and then vulnerability backlogs keep piling up, teams keep drowning. But all that essentially goes back to making vulnerability prioritization that much more critical, because we can't fix it all. We need to focus on what do we need to fix that matters.
What steps would you recommend to take to actually implement, proper vulnerability prioritization program in place?
So I'm just smirking because I wrote a whole book on vulnerability management, effective vulnerability management. So it's hard to put it in like a
you
short
can
answer.
also read your book, read my book, but
It's hard to put it in a short answer. But I would focus on some of the things I talk about. Is like obviously having a fundamental like asset inventory in place, understand the business criticality of the assets, the data sensitivity of the the systems, the assets, and then rallying around things like known exploitation probability, reachability, compensating controls in the architecture that maybe it's not public facing, maybe it's not X, Y, and Z, but that all is hard because it requires analysis and context across thousands of systems and thousands of users, and it's hard to do that at scale. And that's why we see tools coming out like modern SCA tooling or ASPM and CNAP, et cetera, that you've had people on talking about, runtime reachability analysis. Like all these vendors are trying to say, hey, we can help you kind of bring signal to the noise, because they know teams, both commercial, federal, whatever, all around the world, are drowning in this problem around vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think definitely in the future we'll see more, say, probably something like single pane of glass that helps you to analyze all the context and do all the testing. At least that's where the whole wording goes through, and potentially everything will converge, into ASPM, all the tools, but with more advanced tooling in one place. And I saw that probably a couple of years ago, you mentioned that you got a feedback during your annual review that you were not technical enough, and since then, kind of doubled down on knowledge on cloud security and DevSecOps, and the roles that you picked. You also focused to actually improve your knowledge and get all the certifications, But and since then, I think actually cloud has exploded, like the whole topic of cloud security has exploded. Which knowledge do you think now, in the beginning of 2025, you think, for example, you want to acquire and you would recommend everyone else to acquire?
Yeah, this is, so it's ironic that you asked this, because I did get feedback in an annual review, like, hey, we think you're great, but you're just not technical enough, right? Like, you need to be more technical. It's because then I was really good with compliance frameworks and soft skills and communication. That was, but I wasn't super technical technical, right? I wasn't very hands-on. So I took that personally. I went and got like 11 certifications, or 9 of them, I forget however many it was, help, start writing some exams for AWS as a contributor, got Kubernetes certified, got much more hands-on around application security. And just, I like learning too. So like I did those things, as part of that, just like to understand something, because I'm a firm believer in security. We can't really secure something unless we understand how it works. And like right now, I'm deep diving on everything I can get my hands on around AI and Gen AI and LLMs and trying to understand like those technologies. But I would say it's really ironic that I got that feedback too, because when we look around at security leaders, what are we hearing now? Security needs to speak the language of the business. Security needs to learn how to communicate. Security needs to have empathy. Security needs soft skills. So it was like the things that I was good at that I was told were not sufficient, now are the things that we all need to have to be effective at the highest levels of leadership. So, I'm glad that I got the feedback. I went and learned a lot, and I still always try to, keep a baseline level of technical knowledge. But I think I can't stress enough, like learning how to communicate, learning how to be a storyteller, learning how to build relationships with your peers, build trust, have empathy for developers and engineers, understand the broader business context. Those things are not quote unquote technical, but I think most security leaders now will tell you like those will serve you far better and serve them far better now in their roles than being the most technical person in the room.
And sometimes it's harder to acquire those as well, because sometimes it's just some people are born with it, but it's hard to be a good communicator if you've been very technical from the start. That's what I see with the
That's absolutely true. I mean, there's people in our career field, like we're used to looking at a terminal or looking at a screen. Like we don't want to talk to people. We don't want to be in a room full of people. We don't want to be up on a stage or, anything like that. And it's just maybe that, and that maybe you stick to your strength. Maybe you're very good as a technical leader, right? Or an engineering leader or whatever the case is. And then maybe other people, you're not the most technical, but you enjoy talking to people. You like having communications. You like building relationships. So I also don't recommend people don't lean into their strengths, because we need all those kind of skill sets.
So, for example, since communication or soft skills were one of your strengths, did it somehow also help you in your career to progress?
Yeah, I'd say definitely. Like, I'm still growing and learning and trying to develop myself all the time. But like, I've done a lot of consulting now, right, with different organizations for different federal agencies, different, commercial companies, et cetera. And it's almost never a technical problem. Like we have the technology, we know what products we need to use, we know what needs to be done, but it's people, it's egos, it's incentives, it's people have initiatives and reasons they're doing something, right? Like it's always coming back to building those relationships, building trust, getting buy-in, getting executive buy-in, those kind of things, understanding different people's incentives and motivations. So those skills have helped me better than anything, because you come in to do anything, whether it's implement a secure SDLC, AppSec initiatives, GRC things, whatever the case is. What's the organization? Who's involved? Who are the key players? What are their personalities? What do they care about? What do they not care about? Like, how do you get them on board? Like those things are all things you need to do no matter what the initiative is and whatever the technical focus area is.
And when you do consulting for federal agencies, apart from, communication and ego part, what do you think is the most challenging thing?
I think it's a cultural thing. It's getting organizations to try something different. Because, they're very rigid by the book. The process says, the policy says, we've always done X, Y, and Z. So getting people to try something new can be a challenge, especially in an environment where they're not incentivized or rewarded for taking risk. Like if they take a risk and something goes wrong, they get in trouble. If they don't take any risk, they don't really get in trouble. They did what they were, supposed to do. They followed the process. I think getting people to try something new, a new way of doing things or thinking about things is important and is key. And I think we're getting there. Like we see initiatives like Zero Trust and modern AppSec initiatives, compliance automation and modernization, you name it, AI adoption. Like we are moving in that direction, but it's always a constant battle between complacency and comfort and the way we've always done things versus trying new ways of doing things.
And how do you think we should push our, let's say, company cultures to try new things? Let's say you're a product, security leader, application security leader, and you want to, and your culture just sometimes doesn't allow you to implement everything you want. Well, sometimes it's a budget problem, but quite often it's a culture problem. How would you recommend to take the steps to change that cultural perspective?
I think it comes down to like leadership, delegating and like empowering people to take chances and be, creative and try new things and not being punitive, right? Like for everything and anything that goes wrong. Like, if someone makes a mistake or tries something and they get punished if it goes sideways for everything, right? No matter how big or small, they're never going to take a chance again. Like they're always going to do exactly what they're supposed to do and never stray from that. So I think empowering people to take chances, try new ways of doing things, like, and that's a cultural thing. It has to come from the leadership from the top. But then again, like it's a dichotomy, like everything in security, it has to come with, hey, you can do these things, you can be creative, but here are some risks that we cannot accept, or here are some things that we absolutely must still do. So it's a balance like everything else in life.
I mean, it is always a balance, and sometimes you need to have like resilience for that. So I was very curious to ask you, like, why resilient cyber? Why your podcast and newsletter are called? Why did you pick resilient, as the adjective?
Yeah, I think it's been like 4 years at this point with that name. I started off doing a podcast and like started a Substack and do a lot of writing and all this, but like at the time it was like security to me was always like not when or not if something happens, but when. And then how do we become resilient so that when something happens, the organization can still sustain itself and go about doing business and recover from the incident or a data breach or whatever the case is. Because like everything is never going to be perfect. Organizations are always going to have incidents of some sort and size and whatever the context is. So I think that now the industry is starting to move in that direction too, of kind of this resilience mindset of like not if something happens, but when, and how do we respond from it? How do we recover from it? How are we prepared to respond to it? Integrate lessons learned when something happens to be better next time and improve our defenses. So the concept of resilience like stuck out to me professionally, but also personally, because life is the same thing. You're going to get knocked down. Stuff's going to happen. That's going to impact you. And if you just give up and, kind of laying a ball, like that's not a good strategy. You gotta weather on.
Yeah, I think that's not a good strategy for the long term. And if you want to be happy in life, you just sometimes have to accept also certain things or learn from it. And as you said, you have to constantly learn and from your mistakes, especially what didn't work, and how to improve it in the future. So there's always one question I ask, towards the end of the podcast. If there will be one advice that you could give to the young generation from security point of view, what would it be?
I would say don't be afraid to ask quote unquote dumb questions, right? A lot of times I feel like in security and in professional life in general, like, we're afraid of like asking something because people think we don't know what we're doing. We're incompetent. We're quote unquote dumb or whatever, right? But the only way you learn is by shedding light on those things. Like, hey, I don't know this. I want to learn this. How does this work? Can you help me understand? Not being afraid to make a mistake or ask a question or show that you don't know everything is the best way to learn. Because if you kind of hide those deficiencies, things that you don't know, gaps that you have, you're never going to grow. Right? Like if you just kind of put up this facade that you know things and you know all the things, like you've got this all in control, there's nothing you need to understand better, you're not going to grow. So I think shedding light on that, being open, being transparent, it also makes you much more human to the people that you work with and interact with. Because like, hey, he's a human being, she's a human being, they don't know everything, they want to learn this. That's okay. Like it's a lack of ego, basically. Yeah,
well, lack of ego sometimes it's very hard to, ego in general, it's very hard to overcome, whether professionally or personally. Sometimes it's even impossible subconsciously, for sure. And if there would be one book that you could recommend, apart from your 2 books on security, what would it be?
So I'd actually recommend, again, like a non-technical book. I think you've had Ross from Venture and Security on the show, maybe, I'm not sure.
No,
but he has a book called, what is it? Is it?
Cyber for Builders.
Cyber for Builders. Yeah, sorry, I had to look at my bookshelf. So his book is a great read because I spent, like I said, the most of my career looking at certain tools and certain products and certain, security concepts. He takes a step back and looks at security as an ecosystem. The buyers, the sellers, the organizations, the product vendors, the investors. And like being in security, sometimes we really kind of don't realize that like we're part of a broader ecosystem and that there's all these different players involved. And it helps, like at least it helped me understand the cybersecurity ecosystem from a non-technical perspective of like what's driving some of the things. Why do I see the products I see? Why is my organization being approached by these vendors? What are all these acronyms? Like what's driving all these acronyms? Like these kind of things. So understanding the cybersecurity ecosystem more broadly than just the technical focus, I think is a great way to kind of orient ourselves to our career field, to be honest with you.
It is a great book. We actually read it with the whole team here at this game. So it is, I think, perfect book if you want to understand the cybersecurity from a business point of view, and especially if you work in a startup, because then you understand all the MSSPs that you never maybe heard of and never worked with and how they are important to the ecosystem. So it's definitely a great read. Thank you so much, Chris, for coming on the podcast. It was a pleasure chatting with you, and I've learned a lot about federal security and everything and relationships and how it's important for you and learning. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.